minutes past 8 o'clock here on 5:31 PI. Now, the threat of a nuclear war has actually re-emerged after Russian troops seized the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, of course, situated right there in Ukraine. But we want to know, though, what's the impact that would a potential nuclear war have on Aotearoa and the Pacific? So joining us now to have that talanoa about this is a University of Auckland nuclear expert, Dr. David Krofcheck, whose expertise lies in experimental high-energy nuclear physics and, of course, environmental radiation. With that, I say talofa and welcome to the show this morning.
Talofa, Aggie. Thank you for inviting me today.
Absolutely. It is our privilege to have you join us this morning. David, I would like to know, though, first off, what is the potential damage and impact of Russia's attack really on Ukraine's nuclear power plant right now?
Yeah, you would think that you would not have to tell people to do not shoot at a nuclear reactor. But during the emergency of war, people lose their minds. Reactors are normally shielded with concrete and steel, and these reactors at the Zaporizhzhia plant, the largest in Europe, as you point out, are actually pretty safe, but it would take an intense, repetitive bombardment at one single spot on a single reactor in order to penetrate the concrete and steel barrier, and then that would open up the interior of the reactor. And that's when you worry about maybe another shell hitting the actual nuclear fuel and causing it to spread and burn. Wow. So it is a dangerous situation. It's also dangerous if the cooling water, which goes around to cool the reactor, because nuclear reactors are just very fancy ways to boil water. Right. So if you can't, you transfer the heat from the water to a generator, and a generator makes electricity. But if you damage the inflowing cooling water, then that reactor starts heating, and there's no way to take away that heat. And then you get the Fukushima type of story where the reactor literally melts through the floor, and people never thought that would ever happen. But Fukushima proved that it can happen. And so the cooling water is probably the most dangerous part. Also, they keep stored used fuel from previous years for 4 or 5 years in outside pools of water before they put it on a train and send it off to Russia, which is what traditionally the Ukrainian power plant has done. So these are just open pools of water to diminish for 4 or 5 years the residual heat from the nuclear reactor, the old used up fuel. And if someone lands an artillery shell in there, you can have an explosion which can release these stored nuclear fuel debris, but that would be more of a local kind of disaster, radiation disaster. It wouldn't affect us.
But if there was a combined nuclear power, right, between Russia and Ukraine, what they possess, though, if it was used, what then will the scale of damage be?
Actually, Ukraine in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, gave back all of the nuclear weapons to Russia that Russia had based in Ukraine. So Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons. Right. It's Russians with their types of weapons, the tactical battlefield weapons, which are the most dangerous at the moment. And then there are the traditional weapons that we think of the USA and Russia, with intercontinental rockets that could shoot from one side of the planet to the other. And those are city killer kind of bombs. So there were, 10,000 plus weapons, nuclear warheads in the world. And the US and Russia have about, they have more than 3/4 of these weapons in their armory.
Right. That's crazy. I would say, no, it's great to just hear those numbers. This is what a lot of us probably don't ever want to engage in or think about. But if a nuclear war were to break out in Europe, I would then think, would New Zealand and our Pacific Islands, how would they be impacted?
We're fortunate with our geography because it's the same geography, the islands nature of our Pacific area, which has protected us from COVID for so long. It's that same kind of protection that would keep us from having becoming victimized by a nuclear strike, because there are more targets to shoot at, literally, if I would be blunt, in the northern hemisphere. And we would get some radioactive fallout, maybe, I think the numbers show that it's about, could be up to a third of the nuclear radiation that gets produced and attaches itself to soil and soot and goes up in the atmosphere. And then it goes over the hemisphere, which is like a barrier to most of this.
Yeah.
And we would get that little bit of fallout in the southern hemisphere. And that is probably the immediate problem. But in the southern hemisphere, we would also, because we're so connected to the rest of the world is really one big organism. The atmosphere would lose much of its ozone layer for a full-scale exchange, and then we become more sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, which hurts people, which hurts plants. Photosynthesis stops with all the dirt and soot thrown in the air, kind of a nuclear winter scenario.
Yeah.
It could happen even on a limited exchange, and even a tactical nuclear weapons exchange, small. And I hate to use that term small, it's a relative term. Maybe half or a third the size of a Fukushima, or half the size of a Hiroshima type bomb. If we have an exchange on a battlefield like that between NATO and Russia, we could get maybe a year or two of colder temperatures and nuclear winter scenario, and maybe some loss of ozone layer, which hopefully eventually would repair itself.
Obviously, we're already dealing with climate change. That wouldn't be this. Yeah.
Well, it's ironic that nuclear power and climate change happen at the same time, but one can be used to, nuclear power can be used to ameliorate the climate change if we can switch from carbon fuels to nuclear fuels as just a temporary measure. Yes. And then once we build up our solar and wind and hydro power, that way we can reduce and eliminate the nuclear power plants. So this is a transitional period for energy.
Absolutely.
So even with the dangers of the nuclear power, it's no one expects war to occur.
Yeah, no, of course.
But it's transitional for us for nuclear power. We will get rid of it as soon as we have high uptake of solar and renewables.
Cool. If you're tuning in, we are speaking with Auckland University nuclear expert, Dr. David Krofcheck. David, I want to ask that, if we look back in history, right, of course, in my lifetime, I've seen the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Obviously, back in 1954, there was the Marshall Islands nuclear testing. I mean, is there any lessons from these events that we can actually learn and take away from?
Yes, I think so. I was thinking about that, in fact, just this morning, talking with people. The Marshall Islands was not one of America's proudest moments, let me tell you that. The way the United States conducted weapons tests in the North Marshall Islands, and then signed an agreement in 1986, just before Chernobyl, to bury nuclear waste there and leave it to the Marshall Islanders, and give the Marshall Islanders, well, you're allowed to come to America now without a visa, so that's fine. And this is just dishonorable, disingenuous, because we knew there would be nuclear problem with the wearing out of the container in which the nuclear weapons debris was being held. But I think we're all connected. Just think of radiation from Chernobyl, from a different type of nuclear reactor, burning graphite, carbon, essentially. And this was detected and announced to the world by Sweden. The Russians didn't announce it. Sweden announced it because they detected the fallout drifting with the winds. And the winds know no borders. They will partially get across the barrier, which is the equator, where the winds work in opposite directions.
Yeah.
And if we could just realize how connected we are to the rest of the energy from the sun being blocked out, which destroys the crops in another part of the world, and then people starve because there's no food. We are so interconnected
Yeah.
that if people thought about that and seriously took this on board, we might be a little one or two more steps closer to a safer world overall.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, even though New Zealand and Pacific, right, you say that we won't be as impacted by a nuclear war, but is there any way, though, that we can at least maybe prepare for a worst case scenario, though, of a nuclear war?
Yeah, and in fact, that's a good question. One of the things we would miss, and I don't want to be too lackadaisical by saying we would have economic problems, right? Because our big trading partners are in the north. So we would lose a lot of our supplies of medical products, which we import. I think if we could broaden our agricultural base, perhaps, from so much beef and sheep, and maybe a little more agricultural spread, a little more diversity in New Zealand's agricultural sector would help, because we'd be a little more self-sufficient. We could grow our own food and take care of our own population in the neighboring islands, which rely a lot on New Zealand's technology and assistance. And if we could stockpile or have our own pharmaceutical developments and manufacturing, because we rely on the Northern Hemisphere for that. The Northern Hemisphere is a place that would be worst impacted, and we do rely on them for a lot. So we could be more diversified.
I like that. David, sorry, we've got to sort of wrap up, but I would like to know, though, how likely then is it that if a nuclear exchange does take place from Russia?
I can see possibilities for a small scale tactical, again, battlefields, like if the forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, come into contact with advancing Russian forces from Ukraine, because the western border of Ukraine hits on some countries which are members of NATO.
That's right.
And the United States has made a statement. President Biden has said, we will defend every square inch of NATO. And in the heat of combat, nobody cares a few kilometers here or there which country you're in,
right? I
think. So it's possible that there would be a tactical exchange, but we've got to count. I don't want to say I trust President Putin, because I don't, after what he's said and done. But his idea is Ukraine as part of Russia, and he's written this down and said this, and there's a grain of truth, and that's the problem with evil. There's sometimes always a grain of truth. And so we have to hope that Russia and Ukraine, that's the edge, and it stops right there, because any farther than the edge of Ukraine and you will have a NATO-Russian nuclear exchange, at least on the tactical battlefield side, not the city killers probably. I think we're both too afraid of that, but on the tactical side, smaller weapons.
I wish we had more time, Doctor, just to sort of expand this, but hopefully we can catch up again to talk more about it. But look, just really appreciate you coming on board this morning to give us a little bit of insight into this whole nuclear weapons and war and what could possibly happen from there. But again, thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me this morning.
Appreciate it.